I would remind all members that the bill is on the floor is Bill 59. I would ask you to speak to the bill and stick with that, please. Thank you very much. The honourable leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just like to begin my brief remarks by expressing a degree of appreciation and thanks to the many volunteers and advisors to all parties, including our own, who participated in the process over the past year and a bit of gathering information, of providing feedback to the Elections Commission. I know in the case of the PC Party that it was a volunteer effort that included both those that have legal expertise and those that have on-the-ground elections expertise who participated in meetings and hearings around the province, as did similar volunteers from all parties in putting together a new Elections Act. And I do just want to start by thanking them for doing their homework and doing their bit to try and make our electoral process work better. It is with them in mind that I say how sad I am that unfortunately, after all their work, that it was towards the end of this session that a flawed bill did become before this House of Assembly for the consideration by the members here. It came late, it was flawed, it had obvious holes, it required repeated rewrites and amendments, and despite all of that, remains a flawed bill. Madam Speaker, I am glad to report that our approach, the PC caucus approach, was to take the work of our own advisors and volunteers when it came to the Elections Act and attempt to fix the bill by drafting amendments that we identified as important to attempt to make the bill a better bill and worthy of more support. I speak specifically of the amendment to ensure that the voices of disabled Nova Scotians are by law taken into account when regulations around access to polling stations and the ballot box itself are being drafted and enforced. We heard from the League for Equal Opportunities of many examples of where a regulation on access may exist, but access nevertheless remains denied. I suspect that other caucuses have heard the same concerns over time, and I'm glad that we're able to bring forward that amendment to make the bill better when it comes to access for disabled Nova Scotians. Both opposition parties recognize that there was some serious flaws in the bill with regard to third-party advertising. In fact, it was silent on third-party advertising at a time when, without some legislative limits, the sky would be the limit on third-party advertising. We found it odd that on page 6 of the Election Commission's report, there is an entire section on the need for regulation of third-party advertising, and yet the bill that came forward as a result of that report was silent on that issue. And so in law amendments, both opposition parties brought forward amendments to restrict third-party advertising, and then again in this House we brought forward an amendment to restrict third-party advertising, importantly to ensure that there is a remedy when the law is broken before the damage is done, when an election campaign is still underway. Those are some examples of how we have attempted to work constructively here in this House to make a flawed bill a better bill. That, Madam Speaker, brings me to Clause 44 of the bill, which is the clause that, as amended, allows for the collection and transmission of year-of-birth data of electors. And I will say, Madam Speaker, and I mean this, that I do want to commend the members of the Liberal caucus, the member previous who just spoke on their behalf, and the rest of the members for identifying a remaining flaw in the amended bill around year of birth, and I recognize that they took the lead in arguing that that was wrong, and it remains wrong. And I think it's important that in this House we recognize when someone is identified a flaw and done what they can to address it. And I say that sincerely. And in fact, just as I appreciate that the Liberal caucus supported our amendments, and I know they received all-party support and they got included in the final bill, we did listen to the views of the Liberal caucus on the issue of year of birth, and we ended up voting with them against Clause 44 when we went clause by clause in Committee of the Whole House, Madam Speaker. And I just want to make clear that not only did we vote with the Liberal caucus in opposition to that particular provision, that we remain opposed to that particular provision. In fact, I will add that I can assure all members of this House that the transmission of information of that nature around year of birth is not an item that our party ever asked for, ever wanted, ever considered, ever thought about, ever dreamed would become part of the final Elections Act. It certainly did not come from here, and obviously, given the actions of the Liberal caucus in the last few days, it didn't come from there. It begs the question, of course, where did it come from? And we remain opposed to that provision, and we remain concerned about it. And as the bill moves forward, Madam Speaker, I know that all parties in this House, not caucuses, but certainly the parties that do the work to identify voters and get out to the polls, need to make some decisions as a result of the bill about how they handle information if they receive it, and ensure that they're in compliance with the provisions of the bill that are there to protect people's privacy, and make their own decisions about whether they'll receive it and what will happen to that information if we get there. I say that, Madam Speaker, because our approach to this bill all along has been to attempt to find ways to make it worthy of support in this House, to try to find ways to amend it, to make it a better bill. It is true we did not join in the Liberal Party's efforts on Clause 44, although we did vote with them in the end, because our approach was different. It was to try and find solutions. And that is why we brought forward the amendments that we did. I think we'll all have to think through or ask ourselves why we weren't able to get to an amendment on Clause 44 that would have struck the offensive provision of Clause 44 from the bill. Certainly, if it had come forward from any place in this House, we would have been supportive of such an amendment, but no amendment has been forthcoming. And that is why I say it will now fall to all of us to ensure that our respective parties act in a responsible manner, respecting people's privacy when it comes to the information that Clause 44 will provide. Madam Speaker, there are 375 clauses in the bill. We are offended by Clause 44. We do agree, as the previous member had indicated, that on a bill as important as the Elections Act, that it should have the support of all parties in the House when it goes through. That is exactly why we took the approach of bringing forward amendments to make it a better bill. But here we are, Madam Speaker, with a 375-clause bill, one offensive clause, and many other clauses that we need to weigh against that offensive clause. I raised the amendments that we had brought ourselves, the disabled Nova Scotia consultation provisions, the access to voting stations that provision will allow for. The previous member mentioned some of the other parts of the bill that are at least an improvement over the status quo. Provisions that will make it easier for people to vote, make voting more accessible, allow the Elections Commission to do work to try and increase participation in our elections, which is a very worthy objective. And I should add that when it comes to third-party ads, without this bill, the sky would remain the limit. That we have in our country a Supreme Court ruling that struck down limits on third-party advertising and left it to our provincial legislatures to come up with reasonable limits that balance freedom of speech with the need to conduct fair and impartial elections. To our party would be offensive to allow the status quo to be maintained, a status quo where third parties are without limit, where there is not enough provision for access to voting stations for disabled Nova Scotians, where there is not enough power being conveyed to the Elections Commission to ensure that as many Nova Scotians vote as possible. And so because of all those things, we have a choice to make, and we are going to allow the bill to proceed because of the 374 other provisions in the bill. I certainly want to call on all parties to continue to work on a solution to Clause 44, because it is a shame that we have a bill before the House that won't in the end receive unanimous support when it comes to our elections. It is a shame that we have a provision in the bill that no opposition party asked for, and I have yet to understand where it came from on the government side. But here we are, Madam Speaker, and so I hope that as we proceed this morning, or this afternoon, I should say, that all parties will renew their commitment to working on the remaining flaws in the bill as we go forward, see it through the House, and get on to hopefully what will be a day when we can all be comfortable with the Elections Act as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to rise on Bill 59. I want to, first of all, thank the members of this caucus who have been so diligent on looking out and defending what I believe are the privacy rights of Nova Scotians when it comes to this piece of legislation. Madam Speaker, we have raised a number of concerns. One of them is in and around privacy issues and the fact that now political parties will have the right to know whether or not you have voted, know the year that you were born in, and other personal information, quite frankly, Madam Speaker, which I don't believe any political party has the right to know. We've also raised the issue of third-party advertising, which, while in the original bill, and as the previous speaker had mentioned, all political parties had participated in trying to put Bill 59 together so that it came to this House, it would have unanimous support. Madam Speaker, and when it came, we were surprised that third-party advertising was left out of it. It is a flaw that had been identified during the last campaign, had been identified following the last campaign, and quite frankly, the Chief Electoral Officer identified it to the government of the day today and told them that this was a serious flaw in the Elections Act and had to be addressed. Madam Speaker, the Minister of Justice went home to Pictou County and had an epiphany. All of a sudden, he realized third-party advertising had been left out of the Elections Act. Well, they came back with 18 pages of amendments, and I'm not sure, Madam Speaker, that it actually addresses the real problem with third-party advertising. Yes, third parties have to register. Yes, you have to identify your organization, but it doesn't anywhere address the issue of who's funding that organization. And is there limits on that? How many third-party organizations can you have? Those were questions that we wanted the Chief Electoral Officer to have an opportunity to look at. All we asked from this government was to step back. That's all we said. Let's step back and have our concerns addressed. It took over a year for all of our parties to come together with Bill 59 to put together the changes that were presently going to happen to the Elections Act. And then all of a sudden, I think it was on the 6th of May when the bill was introduced. Early next week, we bring in 18 pages of amendments that we have to rush through this House. Madam Speaker, there is no election on the horizon. And contrary to what is said, whether that by-election is called in the next 2 weeks or 3 months, this bill will not be in place to deal with the by-election in Cape Breton North. It is a misnomer, it is a mistruth, and it is a way to try to spin a flawed bill through this House and justify the rushing this bill through the legislature. This will have nothing to do with the by-election in Cape Breton North. Madam Speaker, we think it would have been the right thing for this House to do would have been to set this bill aside and allow the professionals in this province who deal with this issue every day, the Chief Electoral Officer and her team, an opportunity to assess the amendments that were in front of us, to make sure that we were actually closing the loophole that had been identified, one that had been abused by, quite frankly, political parties and organizations to help manipulate the outcome of elections. And this is, you know, and it has been talked in this House about the changes that have come through Bill 59. And it is so flawed, Madam Chair, that making a few changes to it is not good enough, Madam Chair, to get our support for this piece of legislation. When you look at the fact that we still do not know whether or not the loophole around third-party advertising has been closed, I, for the life of me, do not understand why the Conservative Party would be supporting this flawed piece of legislation. Why they would be allowing a party that has had a history of using that piece to go forward. Why they would not want the Chief Electoral Officer to have an opportunity to review the amendments and then make judgment on them and then express to us here in the House how she feels about it, so that we could have a debate on that. Not a debate on one that, quite frankly, has been, in our view, have been rushed through this House, and we've had to stand up here and debate and defend the interests of Nova Scotians when it comes not only to the privacy issue, but third-party advertising. Madam Speaker, this week, because we've delayed this bill, the Privacy Commissioner has had an opportunity to tell us that she's written to the government expressing her concerns about privacy issues. It's rather interesting that over the last week, a member of this House made it clear in public that she did not want her banking records known by the government of today. She wanted a check written. And you know what, Madam Speaker? I agree with her. I absolutely agree with her. That today, we're standing in this House, we debated, and she was waiting for 6 months to be paid by the province of Nova Scotia because she wanted a check written and didn't want to disclose her personal information, her personal banking information. And I agree with her. She shouldn't have to. My father died in 1973. My mother died 2 years ago. Up until that day, her phone number in that book was never in her own name. Her civic address was never identified in the phone book. For one reason, she wanted to protect her privacy. She did not want someone to know, quite frankly, her number. Now, those in the community knew it. People in our surrounding areas knew it. But people who lived across the province didn't know it. And, Madam Speaker, no political party knew it. And why should they know it? If you don't have the courage to knock on her door or doors across this province and ask for their support, why should you have the right to find out that she's living in a particular house, living alone now that we'll figure that out, and have someone representing a political party call and harass her based on information that is none of their business? And that's what's happening in this House. Yeah, Madam Chair, I hear some chirping in the background on the other side of the House. It has not been the Liberal Party that's been accused of harassing voters in this province, and it has not been the Liberal Party, and it has not been the Liberal Party, and it has not been the Liberal Party that has been charged, Madam Speaker, for manipulating financing in the province of Nova Scotia. It has been the one sitting across from us. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, while Bill 59 may be a joke to the members across and the privacy issues that are faced by Nova Scotians may be a joke to them, it is not to this caucus. If they believed in that piece of legislation, they should have stepped back. They should have allowed Elections Nova Scotia to have a review of the amendments, and they should have let the Privacy Commissioner review it, Madam Speaker. As a matter of fact, Elections Nova Scotia are not sure they will even be able to comply with the law. Well, what does that matter? This is a government that is forcing municipalities to break the law. So why would it matter in Bill 59 that the Elections Commissioner can't meet the legislation? This is a government that is trying to bully its way through, trying to make sure that it is going to force on Nova Scotians that they are going to have to give up their personal information so that they can find a way to manipulate the elections in this province. Madam Speaker, we should be stepping back and doing what is right for the people of this province. As the member from Glace Bay identified a few nights ago, these are the rules that we're setting out on how the elections will be run over the next number of years. It is a good member. And he said, let's get it right. Let's get it right. There are people across this province who work for all political parties. As a matter of fact, I've heard from some who work for other political parties telling us, keep up the fight. It is none of the business of the government or any other party in the House and what year I was born in. What's the need for that? And it's an invasion of privacy. I've yet to figure out why the government wants to infringe on the rights of Nova Scotians and dig into their private matters. Madam Chair, this piece of legislation is so flawed. It is so flawed that two independent people, Elections Nova Scotia Commissioner and the Privacy Commissioner, has raised serious concerns. It's not just the Liberal caucus that has been raising those concerns. They have raised serious concerns about this piece of legislation and the privacy issue. And since we've been talking about this issue since Monday, Nova Scotians have been responding to us, and I'm sure the members have been reading letters to the editor and have been responding to the responses that Nova Scotians have had online to articles when it comes to the privacy issue, and en masse, Nova Scotians have said this is wrong and that government should move away from asking for that personal information to ensure that there will be no undue influence on voters across this province. Do the work. Don't ask the Election Nova Scotians to do the work that your political party is unwilling to do. Don't ask them to do it. It's an invasion of privacy, and they know it, Madam Speaker, and they know it. There's only one reason that they want this information, and that is to infringe on the privacy of Nova Scotians and to manipulate the outcome of election campaigns. It's the way it is, Madam Chair. And Bill 59 is flawed, and this caucus will not be supporting it. And Madam Chair, as I said a few nights ago, one of the first acts we will do if we get the privilege to govern this province, will strike out this piece, because it is not the right. It is not the right of politicians, or particularly the government, to be sticking their nose in the private business of Nova Scotians. And this caucus will not sell itself out for an amended piece of legislation for a short piece of crumbs that was added to the Conservative caucus. This is based on principle. And we will make our stand, and we've made our stand. And I've gone across this province, and I will continue to go across, talking about the fact, I hear, Madam Chair, I'm sure if someone wants to get up to talk about the fact that why they want to stick their nose in the private business of every Nova Scotian, I'd be more than happy to hear it. Stand up. Stand up. Be counted, Madam Chair. And it's not just a Liberal caucus. It's not just a Liberal caucus. It's not just the Liberal caucus. It's the Privacy Commissioner who has said they have no business asking for it. His Election Nova Scotians has said, give us the time to review your flawed piece of legislation. Madam Chair, I don't think it's any accident that third-party advertising was left out of the original bill. It was no accident. It was a calculated plan on behalf of this government. It was a calculated plan on behalf of the government. Because Elections Nova Scotia would have told them, first of all, there are still loopholes in third-party advertising, and furthermore, it is none of your business on the privacy matters of Nova Scotians. But instead, they didn't want that answer. They wanted to be able to find a back door, a sleazy way to get it in, to manipulate the process. And that's exactly what happened in this House. They've sat here and they slid it in the back door, behind the backs of Nova Scotians, away from the very people that this piece of legislation will make an officer of the House, and moved it away from making sure that it went through the test and being reviewed by an outside party, Madam Speaker. Why would you do that? For one reason. You didn't want the answer they were going to give you, because they would have said, stay out of there. It is none of your business. It is infringe on the private rights of Nova Scotians. But why we should be surprised? This is a government that was infringing on the rights of one of its own members, trying to force them to give out their banking information instead of writing a check. It's a manipulation, Madam Speaker, of their abuse of power, as they would say. Looking out to try to ensure that Nova Scotians Now they want to dig. It wasn't good enough to be in their own members. They want to dig in the rights of Nova Scotians. Madam Speaker, you might want to make a ruling But as we continue on, Madam Speaker, this piece of legislation is flawed from the very beginning, and this caucus will not sell itself out for some small amendments to ensure that we support that.
Order, please. I would ask that the honourable member retract the word sleazy. It is deemed unparliamentary, and we can proceed. It is unparliamentary.
Madam Chair, let me be clear that I was referring to the process of being sleazy, no individual, but I will remove, strike the word from the record and apologize for that.
Thank you very much.
What would you suggest would be the appropriate word I call them? Madam Chair, they have done and gone around the rules and the process and manipulated them. There's only one way, there's only one reason why that was left out of the original bill. Only one reason. They were hoping to slide it in under the eyes of the members of this House. I'm extremely proud of the fact that the Liberal caucus stood up and defended the rights of Nova Scotians. The minister's going to get an opportunity to explain to every Nova Scotian why he was sticking his nose in their business. He'll get an opportunity to do that. As a matter of fact, I'm sure he'll enjoy it. He'll get an opportunity to explain why he needs to know the year of birth of every Nova Scotian. Since he hasn't done it outside this House, I hope he gets an opportunity to do it soon. But it's inappropriate, unnecessary for any political party to know the personal information of Nova Scotians. Do the work. Madam Speaker, and I'll go back to the very beginning. This piece of legislation is flawed in many cases. Let's back away from it, set it aside, and let the independent bodies outside of the legislature review it, and then we can continue this debate in the fall. With those few remarks, Madam Speaker, I'll take my seat.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I guess there's one last option for the government here, and that's to, at the end of debate today, is to not actually even call a vote on this bill and to call an end to business and hold it over for a vote in the fall. And of course, that would be the right thing to do. The fact is, at the beginning of this debate, there are a number of members on the opposite side who said the elections officer is fine with it, the privacy officer is fine with it. They were chirping that across in heckles, and lo and behold, both have now been in the paper indicating they're not. The elections officer has issued a statement, a very clear statement, saying that they need time, her office needs time to review the act because it may actually violate their agreement with Elections Canada, as it is currently worded. I would think that that alone would be reason enough to delay passage of this bill to sort that issue out. But it wasn't. Then the next day, the Freedom of Information Officer indicated that she had written a letter, that her office had written a letter to the government to indicate that her office also had concerns with the provisions. You would think that by that second item that would be enough to put a hold on it and address those issues before it's finally voted on. That would be the right thing to do, because there isn't a rush on this bill. Madam Speaker, thus far that hasn't been done, but that still remains an option today in the legislature. Those concerns are real. Elections Nova Scotia has indicated it has not been able to find a single other jurisdiction that includes these rules. And we said that on day one, and when I stood up and said that, the member for Halifax Citadel Island yelled across, or Sable Island, sorry, yelled across the floor that I was wrong. And now the CEO of Elections Nova Scotia has come out and said that I was right. The government has not, Madam Speaker, the government has not tabled any information to dispute either what has been suggested by myself or other members of our caucus, or what has been now said by the CEO of Elections Nova Scotia. Nothing. And in fact, when the Premier was asked in the House by the media, he didn't dispute it, in fact. He said, Madam Speaker, that it was a difference of opinion on whether it was an important issue. And that very well would be the case. It may very well be a difference of opinion on how important the issue is, but it should be reason enough to hold the bill over. And so, Madam Speaker, I think it's important to understand why this bill is so important and why now, as the Leader of the Official Opposition quite rightly said, we're hearing from Nova Scotians of all political persuasions and people, frankly, of no specific political persuasion on the issue. And to look at that, we need to go back to the 18th century in Nova Scotia. And why this is an issue? Because the issues that are being addressed today are not new. On February 7th, 1758, the London Board of Trade asked Governor Charles Lawrence to convene a General Assembly in Nova Scotia because they were tired of the kind of rule that was going on at the time. And it took some time, but on May 20th, 8 days before he left to lead a siege against Fortress Louisbourg, he ordered the Nova Scotia's Legislative Assembly to be constituted. And he established the regulations for Nova Scotia's very first election. But it wasn't for another almost a full century later that in fact you had elections in this province that were governed in a way where people had privacy of how they voted. So this is not a new issue on the issue of who voted and when they voted and what community they were in. Because, of course, what would happen before 1847 is the candidates would stand up at the hustings and the sheriff would be the returning officer and people would come in and they would put their name down, they would show that they owned property, and then people would dispute that and the candidates would sit there and they would dispute that people were eligible to vote. And the way, and part of their dispute of how they would vote is when they watched them vote, they would look and they would say, well, I don't think that person's going to support me, so I'm going to challenge their vote. And the sheriff, who was the returning officer at the time, would know how each person voted and would put a tick mark by the disputed elector. And some of these elections would take a long time, and they would. In fact, the longest one at the time, or one of the longest ones, was actually in the Cape Breton township, and it went on for almost a month, the voting, because they didn't have all the voting on the same day. And so by the time they worked their way from Sydney down to Arishat, by the time the sheriff worked his way from Sydney down to Arishat, they were keeping a running total every day, and people knew who was winning in the election. And they could get their people out to vote and rush them down to different polls in different areas because they knew who had voted. Not only did they know who had voted, but they had a pretty good idea of who had voted, and the candidates had stood up and objected to the voters that they didn't support. And so it wasn't until 1870 that we ended up with all the voting happening on one day. And it was significant because there was a book in the library, and there was an interesting petition that came forward to change this. And it wasn't that, at the time, it was as much about the privacy issue as it was about the fact that this resulted in drunkenness and violence, because what candidates would do is they would rent out a house or a location where they would provide accommodation and lodging and alcohol, and so from the folks down in Musquodoboit sent a petition in at the time, and I'll quote that and obviously table it. And it's the opening to a book called The Election of Johnny Bluenose. And the petition at the time said, and I quote, "Your petitioners lament the occurrence and prevailing extent to which scenes of riot and dispensation have been carried out in the late county elections. and suggests the opening of the poll in so very few places collects the freeholders from the extremes so far distant that they frequently are compelled to take shelter in the worst of asylums, the candidates' open houses, and in very many instances are rendered unfit to either demean themselves as tolerable members of the civil society. And I'll table that. And so it was that push at the time, thank you. It was that push at the time, Madam Speaker, that went to this idea that we should have private voting, that we should have all the polls happen in the same day, regardless of where they were in the province. And that was important. But of course, so we dealt with one issue, and they brought in an act at the time called the Simultaneous Polling Act of 1847, which is an act of this legislature, which has obviously been repeated, and it's been incorporated in the Elections Act ever since, and it's incorporated in this Elections Act. That very move is incorporated in this Elections Act that is before the House today. And it's extraordinarily important. I think we would all agree that that's very important. But it led to, it led to all kinds of other things that, members are probably well aware that officially women didn't vote in Nova Scotia until 1920. But it wasn't originally ruled out of order. In fact, in 1793, 6 women voted, and people issued that as challenges against an election in Windsor. But those were issues that have been dealt with in Elections Acts because they came forward, and if you read the accounts of each one of these issues, they were dealt with by the legislature, and sometimes over raucous debates, but at the end of the day, these issues were generally dealt with by consensus of the House when it came to the Elections Act and how elections were conducted. And so it was after those 1847 elections that we had that switch to responsible government, and that one of the challenges, and of course they took force because of a whole lot of reasons. The Tories didn't want to resign at the time, and so they waited until a confidence vote months later. But so you didn't end up with responsible government in taking actual effect until 1848. And we just celebrated 250 years of that, just a couple of years ago. 250 years of that. And then we think that these are new issues, but it was then. So there's the first instance of that privacy issue being dealt with. Well, it was right then that, now we would call it third-party advertising. At the time, they, of course, didn't call it that. But it was those elections that all of a sudden you had various religious factions and various church groups trying to influence elections in certain polling districts. Starting in the mid-1800s, you had Samuel Kennard and Enos Collins were probably the best-known fundraisers for the Tories at the time, who were trying to get these elections won in certain districts. And, but it was about, because you could spend what you wanted on some of these elections. And if you looked at some of the numbers, it was the wealthiest of Nova Scotians, and it was the church organizations and all these, what we would almost call, Samuel Kennard Shipping Line or the church group, that we would call third-party advertisers today. And that's why and so this isn't a new issue. The privacy issue isn't a new issue. The third-party advertising, the who can spend money, these are not new issues. They go back to the beginning of elections in Nova Scotia. And repeatedly, they've had to be addressed through Elections Acts. And so we stand here today on a day that instead of holding this act, which the government could have done a week ago, the government could have done this a week ago. It said, we'll put it on hold, we'll listen to folks. We may not make any changes before we vote on it as the first piece of legislation at the end of the session, but we will at least listen to Nova Scotians. We will respond to and see if we can resolve the issues of the Chief Electoral Officer. We'll see if we can respond to the issues of the privacy officer. We'll see if we can respond to the issues of the fact that the elections officer doesn't even think that she can live up to this and meet the conditions of the Elections Canada rules on the voters list, which Elections Canada owns. But that didn't happen. And so, there were some amendments. The leader of the Progressive Conservatives commented that there was no amendment around Section 44, but he may misunderstand the process slightly, because there was a vote on that, and the member's absolutely right that both opposition parties voted against 44. There wouldn't be an amendment to repeal that section, because that would be just a vote against it. So that you can't amend it to not be there. You just vote against that section, which we did. The Progressive Conservative leader is absolutely correct that, you know, he had a couple of they had a couple of amendments there. It's unfortunate that they actually didn't get what they asked for originally on the having a representative for the physically challenged on there. They actually wanted a representative on the commission. They wanted a representative on the commission.
Good thing.
It's a great thing, but they settled for legislated consultation. And I've talked to a couple of groups already, said, well, they already consulted us. And so, yes, it is a step forward. It's there. It means that it's easier to challenge if it doesn't happen. But to give in on the whole act just because there's a couple of modest improvements, and they are improvements. I don't want to take that away. But the fact is that the decision has to be made. There may be no perfect act. There may be no perfect bill of the legislature. But the question comes down to how important are specific issues. And I would argue that the issues of privacy are among the single most important issues, not only in Nova Scotia, but around the world these days. We need only look at issues from, I mean, look, go to something as silly as Sony PlayStation, which was apparently, I've never used a Sony PlayStation, but apparently it was down for weeks because of a privacy issue. You know, these are not small issues. These are hugely critical issues. Privacy issues are the paramount issues. And so the other thing that we've seen in the past week or two, especially since the federal election on May 2nd, is a number of provinces moving to amend their own elections legislation. And on the weekend, the first thing I noticed, I think it was on the weekend, I picked up the paper and the first thing I noticed was Ontario. Well, and trying to address issues that had come up federally. And one of the issues that they addressed was one that I faced, and that we had filed a complaint with Elections Nova Scotia after my own election to this assembly. When there was a number of people making phone calls on election day to people with Liberal signs on their lawn, telling them not to worry. The polls were having extended hours, and they would be open till 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and they could go out and vote. And the elections, and so a couple of people had recorded the message on their phone, and it's fine. And the Elections Nova Scotia had looked into it, they investigated it, and it was from a disposable cell phone, and so they couldn't trace. They agreed it happened. It wasn't. Election notice, yes, it did happen. It's definitely not allowed, but it was disposable cell phones. So unfortunately, as we all know with disposable cell phones, they're generally untraceable. And so it was dropped. But Ontario's moved to actually place specific fines for things like that. And that doesn't matter whether that's action that's conducted by a political party or whether that's action just by an individual. But why? It just points out the fact that there was another opportunity here, that by leaving it for the summer and having this to be the first thing we vote on in the fall, would have allowed us to also look at things that had come up in the federal election, some things which have come up as a result of new technology that exists now that didn't exist 22 years ago when the last major amendments to the Election Act happened. We could have looked at those and said, well, my goodness, are any of the issues that other provinces are now looking at addressing, maybe we should include those as well at the same time. And to me, that's what this is really about. And the final issue I wanted to address is, let's not forget that this is retroactive legislation. This issue, this legislation provides information to to political parties about who voted in the last election, not on a go-forward basis, but in the last election. And so we're changing the rules of engagement. The member for Glace Bay used the phrase that these are the rules of engagement, and that's exactly right. It's the best description of what the Elections Act is that I've heard said in the House. We're changing them retroactively. We're going back to the last election and saying, all those people that went to the polls not realizing that this information was going to be provided, guess what? It's going to be provided now. It's going to be provided without ever having the permission that that happened. And so, Madam Speaker, I can stand here and hope that the government would, at the end of debate today, call the end of business without a vote and allow the vote to happen when we return in the fall. I don't believe that that's going to happen, but it's a way out for the government. Because I think the most important thing with this, in light of the fact that we're not in a minority government situation, would be to have an act that addresses the concerns that have been brought up, responds to those concerns, and the Minister of Justice can sit there and yell across the floor that they've responded to the concerns, but you have the CEO of Elections Nova Scotia and the Privacy Commissioner both saying that they haven't, and I'll take their word above the Minister of Justice on this issue, that they feel that those issues haven't been satisfactorily addressed to their concern. And in fact, the CEO of Elections Nova Scotia is saying that they haven't even finished looking into that yet. So the fact is, I will take their word because they are the independent officers of this body. And this act, in fact, it proposes to make the CEO of Elections Nova Scotia, the Chief Electoral Officer, an officer of this legislature, just like the Auditor General. That's a good thing. That's a good thing, Madam Speaker. That's a very good thing. But it's ironic that that just before making that making that person an officer of the legislature, just before doing that, they're not going to take her advice and put this on hold. That's problematic to me. So, Madam Speaker, I appreciate the time of the House, and I appreciate that the honourable members across the floor, even though I'm sure they disagreed with much of what I said, I appreciate that they listened.
For a change.
I think that this is an important issue. I don't think that this is a new issue. I think it goes back to the days that elections started in Nova Scotia, and I think that this is being handled wrong and could be handled better. So thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's my pleasure just to say a few words on this third reading of Bill 59, the Elections Act. And what I really feel at this time is a sense of pride about the work that was done by the Liberal Party and the members of this caucus over the last week in terms of speaking loudly and at length. And I know that some of the members may not have appreciated that because these are things that you didn't want to hear, and these are things that you hoped would go unnoticed. And I know that. I believe what the leader of the Liberal Party said, that when the amendments were brought in, 18 pages of amendments on the fly, that the intent was to overwhelm the opposition, that we wouldn't pay attention, and that exactly what you wanted would go through unnoticed. We were told and given assurances that the amendments put before us were nothing more than a reflection of what is in federal legislation, and that it would reflect what opposition members were asking for, that we now have in the Act provisions to restrict and control third-party contributions and advertising during an election. That kind of third-party activity which can unduly influence the outcome of an election, which is really interference in an election in many ways, if it's left completely wide open. We understand that there's a right for organizations to speak and to have some say, but political parties have limits, and so too should third-party involvement in an election. And that we wanted that in the Act, and it wasn't there to begin with, despite two previous reports by the Chief Elections Officer calling for it and recommending it. And as I said before, the one expert in this province province on elections, or the best expert, is the Chief Electoral Officer. And we also looked to the advice of the Electoral Commission, which included all party membership. They also were asking for third-party restrictions on advertising, and yet it wasn't in the original bill. And as I said, the amendments thrown in front of us after the bill had already come out were 18 pages in length and were really done on the fly. And the fact was, we didn't trust what was in them, and when we took a closer look, Madam Chair, we found that we were right to be concerned and to be alert, because there were in fact privacy issues that are raised by the amendments that were put before us. And as we spoke about this on Monday at great length, and you know, following the government's call of hours that were a 12-hour sitting of the legislature session, going from 12 noon to midnight, and as our members stood up and took their turn and spoke against these amendments, and spoke in favor of greater clarity and transparency. And in fact, what I spoke most strongly on was, why haven't we heard from the Chief Electoral Officer? Why isn't the government taking a moment to see whether the expert that we trust enough to make an independent I guess, officer of the legislature, the bill in fact does change the status of the Chief Electoral Officer, and we were taking that step to elevate the status of the Chief Electoral Officer and the work that she does, and yet we didn't take enough time or show enough respect to hear whether or not those amendments had been considered by that office, and whether or not they were in fact possible. Did they contravene any other acts, or did they create other problems? So, Madam Chair, as I stand here and say I'm proud of the work that we did here as a caucus and that our leader did in leading us in this charge, at the same time there's an element of embarrassment that I think this House should recognize, and that is that the history of voting in this province has not always been stellar in terms of our practices. I believe we've heard some of the history of it in the past and how we came to address certain problems over the history. We've had a long history of democracy, 250 years in Nova Scotia, but not always the best electoral practices. And, you know, a recent, I guess it's an opinion article by Marilla Stevenson, you know, basically ended on the note that we have once again, I'll just quote from this article, it says, and I think it is an embarrassment. It says that, so Nova Scotia's political system, which has such a stellar record of avoiding political shenanigans, and that's very tongue-in-cheek, Madam Chair, that take voters and their money for granted time and time again, has found a way once again to distinguish itself from the rest of the country. And that isn't distinguishing itself in a way that we would like to be distinguished as having the best act or the best standards. It's once again finding loopholes and finding a way around what is most transparent and most I think, proper in terms of how we would run our affairs in this province. And so rather than moving forward and becoming more modern and more progressive in this province, which we would have expected over the last 2 years, we've taken another step backwards with the amendments that are before us today. And that is why we spoke out against them, and that's why we will vote against them, because it's not right. We didn't support the amendments as they came through. Other than the amendments that we did agree with from the Conservative Party, we did not support the amendments that affect people's privacy in this province. And we know that that is a regressive step. And again, as I say, the word loophole certainly is allowed here in the House. And I will say that there was a loophole put in there, or an extra provision that was I guess a bonus for the government while they tried to do the right thing on third-party advertising. They slipped an extra, clause in there that requires the Chief Electoral Officer to provide information on people's age, or at least their year of birth, which would equate roughly to their age, and also on their voting habits, whether or not they voted in the last election. And the Chief Electoral Officer as well has had the opportunity to make a statement after we delayed the passage of that bill here on Monday and Tuesday, so that we were able to hear from the officers of this House that we rely on for information like this. One of them is the Protection of Privacy Review Officer. And I think that's very important, that individual that we rely on to make sure that all legislation complies with the privacy acts and requirements of a modern-day democracy. And she has spoken out and raised a red flag about this proposal, which is, you know, about to become law here today as we go to third reading and continue a little bit of debate on third reading. So I feel, I in fact, Madam Chair, feel vindicated, and I think our entire caucus has been shown to be on the right track, because we've heard not only from the Protection of Privacy Review Officer, we've heard from the Chief Electoral Officer, we've heard from Democracy Watch Canada, all of whom have said this is wrong. And I think that that means that the government has to look squarely in the mirror and see exactly what it is that they're doing here today. It can't be brushed under the rug, and all the members of the government, including backbenchers who probably weren't involved in these kind of shenanigans, you know, now have a clear view of what exactly has gone on. And as we go forward, I would ask again, just as other members of this caucus have, that perhaps a little bit of sober second thought be exercised, and that the government perhaps hold that bill and bring it back in the fall, having done more consultation and discussion with the very officers of this House that are engaged and paid well to guide us and help us to do the right thing at all times. I mean, these are independent officers of the House who really, you know, we should regard with a higher level of respect, and we should be listening to the advice they provide. And I would ask that the government consider that again, you know, in light of the embarrassment and the black eye that we are getting once again in the national scene, to be seen as the one province in Canada that would take a step like this at this point in time when privacy is so much in the news and so much an important factor to all Canadians. And I think in view of that and in view of this embarrassment, that the government should reconsider and hold back the act and do the right thing and just correct this mistake that was brought in on the fly, for us at least, maybe well planned on the government's part, but thrown at us as a set of 18 pages of amendments to an act that people very sincerely worked on for over a year to see that the best act could come forward, that the Electoral Commission, representing all parties, sat and worked out and crafted with the blessing of the Chief Electoral Officer to bring before us a good act, and it's essentially been undermined by this 18 pages of amendments, which, as I say, Madam Chair, you know, we take exception with, and we stand up to point out the errors that are in there and the fact that this is regressive and takes us back in time to an era of elections in Nova Scotia that were an embarrassment. And I think we should be moving beyond that and not repeating those mistakes of the past. And with that, Madam Chair, I would like to complete my comments for today. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I just want to make a few comments today. I spoke at length on Monday evening on this bill, and there's no question that this bill, has an important place to play in the province in relation, of course, to our electoral process, and it did need an updating. And as a number of members have pointed out, there are in fact many positive aspects about this bill. I know the one that as a longtime educator that I very much found myself akin to was to see that 16, 17-year-olds could now be engaged in the electoral process. And again, what a wonderful learning, mentoring opportunity, and to have an understanding of that process and to engage themselves. And I just really wanted to stand today and say that over the past week, especially since Monday, 4 of the areas that I heard from my constituents speaking about, one of them was that they were hoping that the Elections Act would actually make a provision around enumeration, because I live in the Kingston-Greenwood area, 14-wing Greenwood, with 2,000 forces personnel moving in and out of the area. There was a lot of people who felt that there should be some designated areas where, in fact, enumeration should be a natural part of the process of conducting a provincial election. The other one that I heard about, and again, it's of course a lot of people in my riding associated with the military that come from other provinces and wondering why we didn't have a fixed date for elections, since we're now part of a small minority in that regard, and they were hoping to see in the Elections Act, or as we talked about it, that would have been one of the positives that we would have noted. But of course, it's not there. The biggest outcry, of course, as many of my colleagues have pointed out, are the 18 pages of amendments that came in from government to deal with third-party advertising. And again, several people pointed out, why wouldn't the chief electoral officer have an opportunity in some manner before all 52 legislators to provide some insight into how she thought this, in fact, was going to be, what it would mean in its implementation, what it would mean in its, of course, interpretation. And that is indeed the major aspect that more and more Nova Scotians, as we've talked at length on this bill, are coming to realize that, in fact, it's now one of the real deficiencies that is in Bill 59. That the chief electoral officer did not have an opportunity to speak about how she saw where the amendments enter into Bill 59 and in fact how it will play itself out. The issue, of course, that has garnered the greatest amount of attention is the infringement on privacy. And I can't think of any issue that, in fact, triggers tremendous reaction from individuals and groups of people is when they feel their privacy has been disregarded. Our offices are asked to be places where we safeguard privacy, where I get people to sign a form to in fact allow their information to go forward and to have cleared and that I have cleared with them when I approach an agency or some department, that in fact I can speak on their behalf. Privacy is a highly regarded aspect of living in the 21st century. Look at the outrage that we've seen when just basic lists of people who subscribe to, Time magazine or Maclean's, and those lists are sold, to organizations, and all of a sudden we get, that third-class mail coming. And how did they find out, who I am and where I live? And I think very strongly, and that in fact that has been pointed out by three major bodies, that we've moved down a road that is unprecedented. The Chief Electoral Officer, the Privacy Commissioner, Democracy Watch are all pointing out that we in Nova Scotia have moved into an area of violating privacy that we, in fact, that government, nor organizations, nor agencies, nor an electoral process should, in fact, have a hands-off approach to. So Madam Chair, this is a bill that I think time will tell us very clearly that we should not have passed in this session of the legislature, that we should have put it in a holding pattern and allow those that know in the finest of detail and in the greatest of interpretation and in their wisdom guide the House through what will be a piece of legislation that, yes, can be amended in time, and I'm sure it will be. But that is going to guide elections for the next quarter century, and that we should have done due diligence in the name of the people of the province and had this set aside for the summer months to once again to be looked at and to have Nova Scotians with great assurance and great comfort that indeed it was going to be ultimately and 100% in their best interest. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, I rise on this bill. It's a great concern to me and many people I've been talking to. And when you talk to people in the community, there's a tremendous amount of concern over the bill. We've just seen recently the Auditor General's report with the Department of Municipal Affairs, Service Nova Scotia Municipal Affairs, has been chastised by the lack of security in their computer systems. And if you look at that lack of security, which is totally within government, and they're going to make election lists available with people's birth dates on them, names and other information, which I don't think is appropriate. It's not necessary in any election I've ever run, and I've run probably as many as anyone in this House. It's not appropriate. So if you put that list out to many, many people, eventually there's going to be a problem. There is going to be a problem. Somebody's identity is going to be stolen, or maybe a whole group of people's identities are going to be stolen. And then who's going to be responsible? I guarantee you, I do not support this bill in its present form. I agree with my colleagues that this should be held over for the summer to have more opportunities for people to have input into it. And without that, I feel that we're going to be a lot worse off come the next election and the election after that. And I'm sure this election, this act will be amended. It will be amended by new members of a new government that would really look at the fairness of elections and the things that happen around elections. I can tell you, in my own case, I've seen many, many questionable activities happen during election time. And I think it'll get worse if people have the personal information on people. And I think that's one of the critical things in this bill. I think could very easily been waited till next fall to talk about this. All we've seen from everybody that's talked about, the people that live with this and work with this every day in Elections Nova Scotia don't agree with the bill. So it really raises some very serious questions. So unfortunately, the government has decided to ram this through, and I want to give credit to my colleagues here for the work they've done to bring this to the attention of people in the province. And hopefully, as time goes on, they'll become more aware of it. And as I've told my colleagues over there in the back bench before, you want to watch out on the next election day and see what happens as people become aware of this activity and how it's going to negatively affect them in their areas. I'm very disappointed in the Conservative Party that made a deal with the NDP to vote for the bill. I think it's a coalition that isn't in the best interest of Nova Scotians, but they will too bear the fruit of their activities in that regard. And with those few words, Madam Speaker, I would just encourage the government again to hold this over till the fall and have some more consultation on it, maybe some amendments in the fall. But I realize that they're probably not going to do that, and it's very unfortunate they're not going to do that. But in any case, I would just encourage them to do it and look forward to their motion to that effect shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm rising today to speak very briefly on these changes to the Elections Act. Some of the changes that the government brought in we thought were good. We were pleased to see the amendment that in fact instituted some kind of third-party rules around third-party spending. Probably not as clear and transparent as we would have liked things to be. We would have liked things, my concern, for example, is we've taken out corporate and union spending from donations to campaigns, but now can go to third-party spending, and it will not be clearly identified that those third parties will, in fact, where the money came from. So in some ways, we've just sort of we've added another layer of opacity to the process. I do think that the amendments that are the third party brought in are improvements, although I would have liked to have seen in fact someone from the disability community on on the Electoral Commission's board, because in fact that would have been a major step forward. The kind of, quite frankly, consulting, well, they could call up my Aunt Janet, who's legally blind, and say, what do you think of this bill? And boom, they've consulted, that's it. There's no indication what groups they even have to consult with. Our concern around the other amendments that the government brought in at the 11th hour was that it seemed to be done as if they were trying to sneak things in. I was sitting over in law amendments when we first took a look at those changes, and quite frankly, the age thing jumped out at me immediately. I was quite shocked that the government was trying to bring this in. Some of the changes that the government is planning to bring in will allow us to identify who voters are in very small polls and how they voted. And if you believe in the if you believe that secret ballots should be sacrosanct, you should have concerns about that. And rest assured, we will be making sure that Nova Scotians know who brought this in. I spoke to the Minister of Justice, who told me that the age provision was just so they could identify young voters and get young people to vote. But we all know there's another less invasive way, and that would be to actually educate young voters about government, about the system, about an election, about forms of government. But that hasn't happened. There's no civics course. And why we would use this invasive tool instead of giving them proper tools to actually think about these things is beyond me. And my concern is that the information the government is now asking for gives parties information on the voting history of electors. Quite frankly, when I spoke to the Justice Minister about this, he said, well, parties already do this. And I said, well, then why bother? The fact is, some parties do it better than others. And if they're willing to do the work, they should get it, fine. But to actually just haul off and give it to them, to have Elections Nova Scotia do the work that their volunteers should be doing on Election Day, I think is wrong. I think it will not encourage electors to vote. I think when people realize what's happening, it will actually turn them away. They don't want to go to the polls. They're not going to want to go to the polls because they don't need their neighbor or person down the street knowing how old they are. It's none of their business. It's none of our business. A number of columns have been written about some of the changes that are coming through. And Marilla Stevenson from the Chronicle Herald wrote, "Why does it matter whether political parties are told how old you are or whether you voted the past few elections?" And she goes on to say, "I'll tell you why. It matters because it gives those parties the ability to manipulate a process that is intended to be free of manipulation. It will take the parties no time at all to use that information to their political advantage. It's not supposed to work that way." And later on, she goes on to say, while the NDP gave to the integrity of the process with one hand by restricting third-party advertising, they were busy taking away with the other by allowing parties to access voters' personal information. There is no other voting jurisdiction in the country that reveals voters' ages or voting records, according to Elections Nova Scotia. There's no reason for these changes, except to make the jobs of political parties easier, and quite frankly, I don't think they should be easier. I think we should have to work for the information. The Privacy Commissioner sees problems with this aspect. And it's funny, because I went back to the May 6th press release from the Minister of Justice, and he says, the press release says, the changes modernize language and offer improvements such as, and it lists a number, and then it says improved protection of personal information. I fail to see how putting out personal information about people's ages and their past voting history is going to actually improve the protection of their personal information. In fact, it will not. And I'll table that press release. And in his remarks, when he introduced the bill in the first place. He said the act reflects a greater emphasis on the importance of protecting the personal information of electors. We are all well aware of the risks of personal information being misused. This act ensures that the personal information in the list of electors is used for its intended purpose. It does nothing of the sort. In fact, it puts more information out there. It makes a mockery of what this minister says the act was actually doing. Finally, if this government were really concerned about elections, they would have looked at what happened in the federal election. And my colleague from Dartmouth East referred to this when there were a number of instances where automated phone calls went out advising electors that their polls, in the case that happened in Ontario and in Dartmouth, Cole Harbour, was that people were told to go to another polling station. When my colleague for Dartmouth East had the problem, they were told that the polls would be open longer. But in this past federal election, it was around telling them to go to another polling station. So what did Ontario do? And I'm quoting from the Globe on May 18th, 2011. The government introduced legislation on Tuesday that would make it illegal for anyone to attempt to stop voters from casting a ballot in a provincial election by tricking them into showing up at the wrong polling station. The Ontario Elections Act already bans corrupt practices, but the amendments would explicitly target deliberate attempts to misdirect voters to the wrong polling station. The maximum penalty for those convicted of election fraud would be imprisonment for 2 years less a day, plus a fine of up to $25,000. The current maximum penalty is a jail term of 6 months and a fine of $5,000. Now, there's a practical step that would make sure that the conduct during elections is actually above reproach. Did this government bother to do that? No, they didn't, because they're too busy ramming it through, and they don't really care about running a fair election.
Order, please. I would ask that the member table that document, please. Oh, sorry, forgive me.
Madam Speaker, I have to say that I'm sad today to see this go through. I honestly thought the government would sit back, take note of the objections raised by its own officers, and how ironic that this legislation is going to actually make the chief electoral officer an officer of this legislature, but we're not going to actually listen to her when she says, oh, hold on, this is not correct. How ironic is that? And you know, I don't believe that the backbenchers knew that this was going on. I don't think they knew about these amendments. I think that they were probably just as shocked as the rest of us. But it is wrong, it is not right, and the government should be ashamed. Thank you.
Thank you. The motion on the floor is for third reading of Bill number 59, the Elections Act. Question has been called. Question. All in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Nay. The motion is carried. I recognize the clerk.
Bill number 59, entitled An Act Respecting the Election of Members to the House of Assembly and Electoral Finance.
Ordered that the bill do pass. Ordered that the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That concludes the government's business for today and for this session. I think we will be awaiting the arrival of Her Honour, Lieutenant Governor. We'll ask for a recess now.
Thank you. I'll now recess and wait of the Lieutenant Governor, Her Honour. Thank you.